So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce Marcel Danesi, who's Professor Emeritus of Semiotics and Linguistic Anthropology at the University of Toronto. He's the author of a number of books, including this recent one, Warning Signs, and I knew this was going to happen, Warning Signs, The Semiotics of Danger, which has particular use and importance for me in surveying and in surveying the field, and lots of different examples of the role of semiotics in nuclear waste and elsewhere. So I'd like to hand over to Marcel, whose talk is entitled Nuclear Semiotics Today.
It is a privilege to be here. Thank you so much. This is such an important topic, even though I come from it to it from a different angle. So let me start. Oh, if I go over my time limit, please send me a signal of some type, a semiotic symbol. Okay. In 1981, the late American semiotician Thomas A. Shibiuk was commissioned by the US Department of Energy to come up with a set of recommendations for designing effective warning signage to be placed at the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Depository site in Nevada that will withstand the test of time 10,000 years into the future. Shibiuk's recommendations were published in a report in 1984, which was instrumental in laying the groundwork for a new branch of semiotics, nuclear semiotics. Makes sense, right? Bolstered by the publication of a special 1984 issue of the German periodical Zeitschrift für Semiotik, which was dedicated to how warning signage could be made effective and enduring across time. Now, very little, I don't know why, but very little has been done in this subfield since then, with only a handful of studies having come forth that utilize semiotics in the context of the dangers that environmental crises pose to human survival. This line of inquiry, in my view, is significant because it might suggest effective ways of influencing people, not only to be aware of a specific danger, and to relay that danger to future generations, but to take appropriate action. The view of many semioticians is that action can be stimulated through representations, not just through language and through actions themselves, but changing beliefs in people's minds. And changing beliefs means changing the semiotics of cognition. That's the basic premise of a nuclear semiotics. In fact, it is such a fundamental premise that I'm going to recount an anecdote, and I want you to humor me, an anecdote of a well-known story about the Polish-American scholar Alfred Korzybski, which is worth repeating here. Again, if you know it, please indulge me. As he was giving a lecture to a group of students one day in the 1930s, at a certain point, Korzybski stopped talking and took out a small packet of cookies from his briefcase, telling the class that he just had to eat something due to a sudden attack of hunger. Showing politeness, he offered the cookies to students seated in the front row, some of whom took one, eating it with apparent gusto. As they were digesting the cookies, Korzybski remarked, "Nice cookie, don't you think?" Then he tore off the wrapper around the packet, revealing the original packaging, which showed the picture of a dog's head with the label "dog cookies." The students became visibly upset. Two of them even ran out of the room to a toilet to vomit. Korzybski then turned to the rest of the class and uttered, "You see, I have just demonstrated that people don't just eat food, but also words, and that the taste of the former is often outdone by the taste of the latter." That anecdote encapsulates the essence of what can be called Shibiuk's problem, of course, projecting it into the future. The essence of that game was to show that a label, in this case, a single word, is usually accepted in its normal referential context of usage, and that comes instantly to mind. When this is altered, when the same sign, the same label is projected to another referential domain, reactions, even physical reactions, ensue. Understanding this premise, Semiotics set out to solve what was essentially a labeling problem involved in warnings around the Yucca nuclear site, a problem that can be called simply Semiotics' problem. Now, how did he do it? Well, he's a semiotician. So how do you do it? Well, you start studying warning labels, warning signs, and larger texts, narratives, myths, and so on, extracting from them common patterns in how dangerous perceived by all humans, not a specific set of humans. And this comes out in the form of representations that we understand to this day, and how people have taken precautions and actions through stories, through metaphorical language of the past, and so on. How to take this system of representation that comes from the past into the present and then project it into the future to retain its warning implications. Now, I should say that some of Semiotics' recommendations attracted much attention. A lot of it was due to Tom Semiotics himself, whom I got to know very well before he died. Quirky. People said, what kind of recommendations are these, especially among scientists and other academics, because they were thus characterized as everything from brilliant to claptrap. Now, leaving the praise and criticism aside, his report showed for the first time in the history of semiotics that this discipline could be used practically for studying how to represent data in an effective way. It had never happened before. Now, let me look at his main recommendations. The first one is you have to create, he said, a relay system, projecting meaning of a sign now, constructing a sign that has meaning now, and that meaning can be relayed into the future and preserved. How do you do it? Well, the first thing he looked at was at folkloric systems, mythologies, rituals, which have withstood the test of time, not in their specifics, but in their archetypal essence, because they are based on a cultural memory, and he assumed that that cultural memory will continue into the future through these rituals, mythologies, and symbols that have withstood the test of time. The idea was how to create one to withstand nuclear waste warnings. How to do that. Some of his recommendations were rather abstract and abstruse, but opening up this new vista, I think, was the most important thing of all. After all, I looked at work in geomythology, which is beyond the scope here, but this has argued that the ancient disaster and catastrophe myths were accounts of actual disasters couched not in scientific language, but in mythic language. The fact that this language has survived the test of time intact is indirect evidence that Semiotics was on the right track. We still understand, the ancient ark and flood myths of antiquity as disaster myths. The difference is that we interpret them differently, not in the same, how can I say, divinatory terms of the past. Okay, he was keenly aware, however, that his idea would be misinterpreted as superstitious nonsense. But his premise was simply that most people, to this day, respond to folkloric language and narrative more intuitively than scientific language, which has to be learned. So, first recommendation was to use folkloric artifacts as a false trail, not as factual information. A subsequent work shows that you can write stories for children, do other kinds of visual artifacts, including memes that can retain the essence of folklore, adapting it to the present situation. Now, I should say, because the situation becomes even more a little bit weird, because one of the two of the writers in that special issues of the Zeitschrift took him seriously and made their own recommendations. They were Françoise Bastide and the late Paolo Fabri. They put forward the idea of using ray cats, R-A-Y cats, namely breeding a species of cats that would react to discoloration when exposed to radiation. Now, before you erupt with laughter, it is important to note that what the two authors intended is that cats have played key folkloric roles across cultures as warning symbols. So they suggested that new tales and myths about ray cats, referring to nuclear wastes, existential dangers in the environment, and so on. In other words, adapt the mythology of cats to the present time, retaining those elements that can probably be projected into the future. Now, the mainstream media reacted instantly. Anything such as saying radiating cats, I mean, would obviously attract attention. But Bastide and Fabri made the proposal in a tongue-in-cheek manner. The main aspect was that the symbolism of certain animals, of certain figures, and so on, will retain, in all likelihood, its meaning well into the future. Now, a less controversial aspect of Semiotics' relay system was to create messages with a mixture of iconic, indexical, and symbolic elements. Iconic signs are those that would represent the danger by resemblance, visual forms, paintings, for example, by existential location, for example, hostile architecture that points out where the danger is, and cultural forms that have resisted the test of time. Another recommendation was, and this became perhaps his most controversial one, was how to continue editing signage for successive generations. This led him to make out his recommendation, which he called the formation of, let me quote his phrase, atomic priesthood. In other words, a commission independent of future political currents and self-selective in membership. Well, there's little doubt that the infelicitous choice of the term priesthood produced the controversy that has always followed Semiotics' report, given the connotations of this term. Now, suffice it to say that the attacks have ignored the fact that similar bodies of experts have been established in all subsequent task forces. We don't call them priests. We call them scientists or experts. Now, one wonders, have we called these priesthoods if the same hostile reception would not apply to this day? He used the word priest because, again, in line with this idea of folkloric continuity, religions have survived the test of time intact, haven't changed at all. So he meant to allude to this resistance to decay that religions had by trying to transfer it over to the domain of science. It didn't have much of an effect, caused nothing but controversy. Let me summarize what Semiotics' report and some subsequent nuclear semiotic research has done in this area. It has raised key questions. I think, from what I could see, that we're the first ever in the history of warnings and of waste sites. One, what is a warning? What is it? How can danger be conveyed effectively? How should a radioactive site be marked to evoke an urgent sense of danger that can also be preserved and relayed into the future? What media can be used best? Could it be language, pictography, scientific diagrams? Semiotics put language to the side because, of course, it is so culture specific, and therefore languages decay very quickly across time, whereas other forms of representation, such as paintings and even narratives, although they are couched in language, do not decay. What cultural strategies and artifacts can be incorporated? Myth, popular culture, rituals, and so on. What overall, what kind of sign system is capable of surviving and remaining interpretable for 10,000 years? Without going into details of how this can be done, the very fact that Sebioc's report and nuclear semiotics has raised these questions, I think, is a key event in the history of this of its discipline. From this, I myself have come up with 7 basic principles to bolster meaning effectiveness and to enter into the relay system that Sebioc talked about. The first principle I will call simply representationality. Now, this affirms that the effectiveness of warning systems varies with the effectiveness of their representational forms. It seems obvious, but it needs to be stated. For example, representations in language tend to be less effective over time than representations in visual iconic forms, such as paintings. And this includes narratives. Narratives are easily translated in the future, whereas other things lose their meaning over time. Now, second principle, I call it the principle of emotivity. Recall the Korzybski anecdote. Notice that the way Korzybski presented his game had an emotive effect on his audiences. It was direct, it was immediate. Of course, artists do this, musicians, all kinds of creative people can therefore be engaged in the creation of signs, not just scientists, because they have the ability to raise, like Korzybski showed, the emotive level, the emotive degree of the effect of a representation. Even changes in language. In Toronto here, I recall when I was teaching 3 or 4 years ago, that Toronto decided to change the term climate change to climate crisis. Now, it seems like to most people, well, what's the difference? The difference is the word crisis. When you say that we are in a crisis, it will grab your attention. If not instantly, at least at a lower unconscious level. It could also have opposite effects.
Would you, we've got like a minute left, so if you would.
Okay. Third principle, relativity. In other words, danger science is relative to the culture in which it is enacted. The idea is to try to transcend that by looking at cultural elements that have transcended the test of time. Metaphoricity, the use of metaphorical language. I'm running a little bit here. Iconicity, as I mentioned, and folkloricity. Now, let me conclude. The nuclear semiotic approach, I think, provides a particular angle from which to view how humans have always attempted to solve Sebioc's problem since activity. And it involves not just scientists and semioticians. The problem involves the participation of historians, but especially creative artists, poets, and others. In fact, in my book, I mentioned about a movement within poetry to raise the awareness level of danger and how that awareness level can be retained effectively through the poetic form. And to conclude, one thing that stands out, in my view, from looking at all such systems, creative systems across times, is that humans have always connected dangers to broader questions of human life. Now, in my view, knowing how to make and read these dangers may be the only way we can get people to enact necessary changes. I quote Mira Reed, who stated in her fantasy novel, A Clash of Kings, the following: "Why would the gods send a warning if we can't heed it and change what's to come?" Thank you for listening to me.